The sky was falling, not rain, dive bombers, dropping straight down out of the sun at 300 miles an hour. And the man watching them fall from the bridge of the proudest warship afloat that morning finally understood the truth that would haunt him to his grave. The Americans had known he was coming all along. His name was Chuichi Nagumo. He was the most powerful man on the ocean that day, a vice admiral commanding the 4 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor. Intelligence swore the American fleet was far away. Every decision he made that morning was correct by the book. But here's the chilling part. Each correct decision pushed him one step deeper into the trap. The more careful he was, the tighter it closed. Because while he waited to prepare his aircraft hundreds of miles away, a team of American codebreakers had already broken into enough of the Japanese naval code to know his target, his timing, and the very direction he would come from. In the next 6 minutes, 3 carriers will be ablaze. But the trap was not set by American bombs. It was set by the Japanese certainty that such a trap could not exist. The Doolittle raid changed everything. On the 18th of April, 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers appeared over Tokyo. They came in low, dropped their bombs, and disappeared. The physical damage was almost nothing. A few factories, some scattered fires, but the damage to the Japanese high command was immeasurable. Bombs had fallen on the capital. On the ground, the emperor walked. The one thing the Imperial Navy had promised could happen had happened. In broad daylight, in the 6th month of a war Japan was supposedly winning. For one man, that humiliation was the final argument he needed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was 58 years old, and he carried a weight no other officer in Japan carried. He had planned Pearl Harbor. He had stood against the war before it began, warned his superiors that America's factories and oil fields would grind Japan to dust in a long conflict. He had said plainly that he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, and after that he promised nothing. 6 months had almost passed. Yamamoto knew the clock better than anyone. Every week that slipped by, American shipyards grew louder, hungrier, faster. Somewhere in those yards, new carriers were already taking shape on the slipways. If Japan was going to win, it had to win now. One enormous, decisive blow that shattered the American fleet and forced Washington to the negotiating table before its industry woke up in full. His answer was a small, unremarkable scrap of coral in the middle of the ocean, Midway. 2 principal islands, barely rising above the waterline, about 2,100 kilometers northwest of Honolulu. To the eye, worthless. But Midway sat like a sentinel on the approaches to Pearl Harbor, and Yamamoto understood that America could not afford to lose it. Threatened Midway and the American carriers, however few remained, would have to come out and fight. And when they came, Yamamoto would be waiting with the greatest fleet ever assembled in the Pacific. The plan was a machine of breathtaking scale and breathtaking complexity. Nearly 200 warships spread across thousands of kilometers of the North Pacific. A simultaneous operation against the Aleutian Islands far to the north, long remembered as a mere diversion, though in truth it had objectives of its own, meant to seize positions and guard Japan's northern flank. A carrier strike to soften Midway, an invasion force of 5,000 troops to seize it. And behind all of it, hidden over the horizon, Yamamoto's own main body, battleships, including the Great Yamato, nearly 72,000 tons at full load, whose 18.1-inch guns were the most powerful artillery ever put to sea. It was elegant, it was overwhelming, and it rested on a single fatal assumption that the Americans would react slowly, predictably, exactly the way Yamamoto expected, rushing blindly from Pearl Harbor into the ambush he had prepared for them. At the sharp end of that plan stood the striking arm of the whole Japanese Navy, the Kido Butai, the mobile force. 4 fleet carriers moving together as one, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Between them, they carried more than 200 aircraft and the finest naval aviators on Earth. Men who had flown combat since China in 1937, who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had run wild across the Indian Ocean, and had never suffered a major defeat. For 6 months, wherever these 4 ships appeared, the enemy burned. They had become, in the minds of the men who sailed them, something close to invincible. The man in command of them was not a flyer. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was 55 years old, a torpedo and gunnery specialist who had spent his career among surface ships and destroyers. He had never trained as a carrier man, never felt in his bones the strange, fast-moving logic of aircraft warfare, where a battle could be won or lost in the minutes it took to arm a squadron. He was cautious by temperament, deliberate, a man who preferred the sure thing to the bold gamble. He had led the Kido Butai to victory after victory, but always the doubts followed him quietly that he was not the right man for this new kind of war. Around him moved the officers who understood carriers in a way he never quite would. Commander Minoru Genda was 37, the brilliant, restless mind who had drawn up the Pearl Harbor attack. He was the closest thing the Japanese Navy had to a prophet of air power. But in these critical days he was sick, laid low by illness, running a fever in his quarters, his sharp judgment dulled at the exact moment it was needed most. And there was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, 39, the airman who had led the strike over Pearl Harbor and radioed the famous signal that the attack had achieved complete surprise. He too was out of the fight before it began, recovering from an emergency appendix operation, watching from the sidelines of a battle he had helped make possible. One division of the force had its own commander, and he was cut from entirely different cloth. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi was 49, leading Carrier Division 2 Soryu and Hiryu with his flag flying on Hiryu. Where Nagumo hesitated, Yamaguchi pressed. He was aggressive to the point of recklessness, a fighter who believed that in war the man who struck first and struck hardest would win. Many in the Navy thought he would one day command the entire fleet. That day would never come. These were the men of the Kido Butai, confident, battle-hardened, certain that the Americans were beaten, scattered, and far away. They were wrong about all of it. Because 2,000 kilometers to the east, beneath the streets of Pearl Harbor, the trap was already closing, and the men who built it did not fire a single shot. In a windowless basement in the stale air and permanent fluorescent glow of a converted office, a small team of American codebreakers worked around the clock. Their unit was called Station HYPO. Their commander was a lieutenant commander named Joseph Rochefort, 42 years old, who was known to shuffle through his basement in a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers, chewing over intercepted messages for 18-20 hours at a stretch. Rochefort and his people were fighting a different kind of war, a war of fragments and patterns and educated guesses. They were reading the Japanese Naval Code, JN-25, pulling meaning out of oceans of intercepted radio traffic. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough to see the shape of something vast beginning to move. The messages kept referring to a coming operation and a target. The target had a codename AF. Rochefort was convinced AF meant Midway. His analysis pointed to it. The pattern of movements pointed to it, but others up the chain weren't sure. Some thought AF might be Hawaii itself or the West Coast. If the Americans guessed wrong and massed their handful of carriers in the wrong place, the war in the Pacific could be lost in an afternoon. So Rochefort devised a trap of his own, small, quiet, and brilliant. He had Midway send a radio message, deliberately transmitted in plain language, easy to intercept. The island was reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down. Midway was running short of fresh water. Then he waited. Within Midway's Japanese message reporting that AF was low on fresh water. That was it. That was the proof. AF was Midway. There was no longer any doubt. The report went to the one man who could act on it. Admiral Chester Nimitz, 57 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, a calm, precise Texan who had taken command in the wreckage of Pearl Harbor and rebuilt a shattered navy on nerve and cold arithmetic. Nimitz now held something almost no commander in history has ever held. He knew where his enemy was going. He knew roughly when. He knew the direction they would come from, and roughly what they would bring. The question was whether he dared to believe it. Because to act on Rochefort's intelligence, Nimitz had to gamble everything. He had to take its few carriers and send them not to defend Hawaii, but out into the empty ocean to a specific patch of water northeast of Midway, the one place the Japanese search planes were unlikely to look. He had to bet the survival of the Pacific Fleet on the word of a man in slippers in a basement. He believed it, and he began to move. He gave tactical command at sea to two men. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a 57-year-old veteran who had already fought the Japanese at the Coral Sea, would hold overall tactical command from the carrier Yorktown. Under him, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, 55, a cool, cerebral cruiser officer who had never before commanded carriers, would lead Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet. Between them, these men would spring the ambush. But when Nimitz counted his carriers, the arithmetic was brutal. Enterprise and Hornet were ready. A third carrier should have been out of the question entirely. Yorktown had fought at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier, and she had been hurt badly. A Japanese bomb had punched deep into her, torn through several decks, killed and wounded dozens of her men. When she limped back into Pearl Harbor, trailing a long oil slick, the yard estimated the repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz gave them 3 days. What happened next has few equals in the history of naval war. More than 1,000 workers swarmed over Yorktown the moment she entered dry dock. They worked in around-the-clock shifts, welding, cutting, patching, hammering by floodlight through the night, the sparks never stopping. The base's power grid was trained to keep the yard Steel plates were bolted over wounds that should have been cut out and rebuilt. It was not a proper repair. It was a resurrection, just enough to make her fight. 72 hours, Yorktown sailed back out to sea under her own power, her flight deck operational, her air group aboard. Nagumo did not know she existed anymore. In the Japanese battle plan, Yorktown was already gone, sunk or crippled, all barrels scratched off the board. The entire Japanese calculation of American strength was built around 2 carriers, maybe, not 3. That one ship, raised from the dead in 3 impossible days, was the card that was not in the deck. The variable Yamamoto's beautiful plan could not account for, and it was steaming right now toward a stretch of empty ocean where 3 American carriers would lie in wait, exactly where Nagumo was not looking. The greatest fleet ever assembled in the Pacific was sailing east, its admirals certain of surprise, certain of superiority, certain the enemy was blind and far away. And the enemy had read the script. Dawn came gray and cold over the Central Pacific on the 4th of June, 1942. Aboard Akagi, the flight deck was already alive. Engines coughed and roared in the half-light. Propellers spun to blurs. Deck crews in colored jerseys scrambled between the aircraft, hauling chocks, checking bomb shackles, waving their signal flags in the wind. The whole ship trembled with the noise of it. This was the moment these men had trained their whole lives for. The Kido Butai going to war one more time, certain of one more victory. At 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, climbed into the brightening sky and turned toward the little atoll on the horizon. Leading them was a young lieutenant named Joichi Tomonaga, flying in place of Fuchida, who was still recovering from surgery. Nagumo watched them go, and then he did what a careful Naval does. He held back. Down in the hangars of the carriers sat the second wave, some 90 aircraft held against the chance that American warships might appear. They were not all ready for such a strike. The torpedo bombers carried their torpedoes, the ship-killing weapons. But the reserve dive bombers had not yet been armed for an attack on ships, and fighters rounded out the package. It was the insurance policy, incomplete but real. For all his caution, Nagumo had not entirely forgotten that the enemy might be out there somewhere. He kept a reserve set aside against the sea. It was the right instinct. It was the discipline of a man who had survived a long war by not taking foolish chances. And then, one by one, every reason to hold that instinct began to erode. The first report came from Midway itself. Tomonaga's strike had hit the island hard, cratered the runways, smashed the buildings, set the fuel tanks burning. But the American planes had scrambled into the air before the attack arrived. The airfield was still functional. The strike had not finished the job. At just past 7 o'clock, Tomonaga's radio crackled with a message that would set the whole tragedy in motion. There is need for a second attack on Midway. Nagumo turned the words over. His first wave had failed to knock out the airbase, and that airbase was a threat, a land carrier that could not be sunk, still launching planes at his fleet. To take Midway, he would need to hit it again. And to hit it again, he needed those reserve aircraft in the hangars. But they were held for ships, not for the island. At 7:15, Nagumo made his decision. He gave the order that would haunt every account of this battle ever written. Rearm the reserve planes for a land attack. Below decks, the order set hundreds of men in motion. In the low steel caverns of the hangars, crews began the slow, delicate, and tedious work of changing a plane's whole purpose. Torpedoes had to be unbolted from their racks, lowered, wheeled away. Bombs had to be brought up from the magazines, hoisted, fitted, secured. This was not the kind of work that could be rushed. A torpedo weighed as much as a small car. A mistake could kill everyone in the compartment, and here is the detail that history often gets wrong, the detail that matters. These aircraft were not sitting on the open flight deck, packed wingtip to wingtip in the sun, ready to fly. They were down in the hangars, where the rearming was done. The danger was not, as the legend would later claim, bombs and torpedoes carelessly heaped and abandoned across the deck plates. It was something quieter and just as deadly, fueled aircraft, aviation gasoline, and ordnance all being handled at once, inside enclosed steel hangars that would trap and amplify any fire or blast. A single bomb finding that space would not merely damage a ship, it would set off everything inside it. Then, at 28 minutes past 7, everything changed again. A scout plane broke radio silence. It had launched about half an hour late that morning, held up by trouble with the catapult aboard the cruiser Tone. That half hour would loom over every account of the battle ever written, but it did not by itself decide anything. The plane's search route, the slow chain of reporting, the time it took to identify what it was seeing, and the endless cycle of aircraft coming and going from Nagumo's decks, all of these pressed on him just as hard. Even a report arriving sooner would have found the Kido Butai tangled in its own flight operations. The scout's message was short and it was terrifying. 10 enemy surface ships sighted, bearing distance course northeast. On Akagi's bridge, the words landed like a physical blow. Surface ships, American surface ships, here, in a place where they were not supposed to be for 2 more days. Nagumo felt the ground shift beneath him. His hangars were full of aircraft in the middle of being changed from ships to the island, and if there were enemy warships out there, he was pulling the ship-killing weapons off the very planes he might need to fight them. But there was still a shred of hope in the report. 10 surface ships, cruisers, maybe, destroyers, a raiding force perhaps, but not the thing he truly feared. Ships he could handle, ships his battleships and cruisers could deal with, as long as there were no carriers. For nearly an hour, Nagumo lived inside that fragile hope. He sent an urgent message back to the scout plane, demanding to know what kind of ships they were. He waited. The rearming below decks continued, half of it torn one way, half the other. The hangars now a case of bombs and torpedoes and men. And then, at just past 8 o'clock, the scout answered. 7 words that ended the world. Nagumo had known. The enemy is accompanied by a carrier. There it was. The one thing that could not be. Americans were not 2 days away. They were here now, within striking range, and they had a carrier with them. The whole foundation of the operation, the intelligence, the timing, the certainty, all of it cracked in a single sentence, radioed from a lone float plane over an empty sea. Nagumo now faced the hardest problem a commander can face, and a clock that would not stop. But there was no strike sitting ready on his decks to fling at the enemy. His reserve aircraft were still down in the hangars, caught in different stages of preparation. Before a single one could attack a carrier, it would have to be armed with the right weapon, lifted by elevator to the flight's decks, spotted in formation, its engine warmed, its squadron organized. All of it while his fighters kept taking off and landing overhead to beat back the American attacks. And there was Tomonaga's first wave, returning from Midway, low on fuel, circling, needing to land soon or ditch into the sea. Every one of those aircraft competed for the same crowded decks. This was not the clean, cruel choice of legend. Change now and abandon your airmen, or wait and strike in perfect order. It was a tangle of timing and doctrine with no good answer. Still, everything Nagumo had learned in 40 years of service pulled him one way. Never send in a divided, disorganized attack. Never throw your aircraft away piecemeal. Recover your men, arm them right. Hit hard, hit once, hit together. His staff agreed. Even Jenda, feverish in his cabin, had counseled the same principle. Wait. Do it properly. At around 8:30, Nagumo gave the order. Recover the Midway strike, bring the men home, then rearm and launch everything all at once as it should be done. It was a reasonable decision, it was a professional decision, and it was the decision that killed the Kido Butai. Because here is the terrible truth at the heart of that morning. Nagumo was not being a fool, he was not being reckless. He was being careful, and his care was the trap. Every choice he made to do things right, to do things by the book, cost him minutes. And minutes were the one thing he did not have. While he worked toward the perfect strike, the Americans had already launched theirs. They had launched before Nagumo even knew they were there. Out on the sea, to the northeast, the American carriers had done exactly what Nagumo feared. The moment their scouts found the Japanese fleet, Rear Admiral Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, had made the opposite gamble to Nagumo's. He threw everything he had into the air as fast as he could, imperfectly, incompletely, gambling that speed mattered more than order. Torpedo planes, dive bombers, fighters launched in a ragged stream and sent west toward the Japanese fleet. They did not all arrive together. They did not arrive protected. They arrived in scattered pieces, and the first pieces to arrive were the slowest and the most vulnerable of them all. The torpedo bombers. They came in low over the water, just above the waves, in old, slow aircraft called Devastators, planes that were already obsolete, lumbering along at a crawl. To hit a ship with a torpedo, they had to fly straight and level, straight at the enemy, holding a steady course into a storm of fire. There was no evasion, there was no cover, there was only the run-in. The first squadron to find the Japanese fleet was the Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, led by a lieutenant commander named John Waldron. 15 aircraft. Waldron had told his men before they took off that if only one plane was left, he wanted that pilot to go in and get a hit. He led them straight into the Japanese fleet with no fighter escort at all. What happened next was slaughter. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the nimble, deadly Z-Rio fighters circling above the carriers, fell on the Devastators like hawks on pigeons. One by one, Waldron's planes were torn apart. They burned, they cartwheeled into the sea, they came apart in the air. And still the survivors bored in, holding their course, trying to reach a range where they could drop. All 15 were shot down, every single one. Of the 30 men in Torpedo Squadron 8, 29 died. One man, an ensign named George Gay, was blown into the water and survived by hiding beneath a floating seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold around him from the surface of the ocean. They did not score a single hit. Not one torpedo found its mark. And then it happened again. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise came in. More Devastators, low and slow. The Zeros tore into them. Most of them died too, and again no hits. And then a third time. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown flew into the same wall of fire, and they too were cut down, plane after plane spiraling into the sea. In all, 41 American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet that morning. Roughly 35 of them were shot down. They achieved nothing that anyone on those Japanese bridges could see. Not one torpedo struck home. To the men of the Kido Butai, it looked like one more massacre in a war full of massacres. One more proof that the enemy was brave and doomed and beaten. On Akagi's bridge, the destruction of the American torpedo squadrons may well have eased the mood. The enemy kept coming and kept dying, and the Kido Butai was still untouched. But the perfect strike everyone imagined was not, in truth, minutes from the sky. The reserve aircraft were still in the hangars. The carriers' decks had spent the whole morning launching and recovering fighters to fend off attack after attack, never free long enough to spot a full counterstrike. What felt like the edge of victory was an illusion built on the wreckage of dead men's planes, because those slaughtered torpedo squadrons had done something no one on the Japanese ships understood. Something invisible, something fatal. To cut down torpedo planes skimming the waves, many of the Japanese fighters had been drawn low, chasing the slow attackers down to the surface, scattering across miles of ocean, some already cycling back to rearm and refuel. Not every Zero had come down. The sky above was not truly empty, but the fighter screen was low disorganized and badly placed, exactly the wrong shape to meet a threat coming from high above. And that is exactly where the threat was coming from. Down out of the high sky, at 14,000 feet, came the American dive bombers. They had almost not made it. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, 40 years old, leading the dive bombers from Enterprise, had reached the spot where the Japanese fleet should have been and found empty ocean. The enemy had moved. His planes were burning fuel he did not have, and the entire strike hung on a knife's edge of a decision. McCluskey could have turned for home. Instead, he pressed us on, searching, gambling with the last of his fuel, and far below he spotted the white wake of a lone Japanese destroyer cutting across the sea, hurrying to rejoin the fleet. He followed it like an arrow pointing home, and it led him straight to the carriers. McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's group from Yorktown arrived from two different directions at almost the same moment. Most of the Japanese fighters were still low and out of position. A few Zeros were up there, but too few in the wrong places to break up the dives. Below them, the four carriers turned in the sunlight, their flight decks largely clear, but for fighter operations. Because most of their aircraft still sat in the enclosed hangars, surrounded by fuel and ordnance, where a bomb punching through would do the most terrible work of all. For a moment, nobody on the Japanese ships even looked up. Then a lookout on one of the escorts saw them, the specks, high in the sun, tipping over into their dives. The alarm went up. Too late. The dive bombers were already falling, engines screaming, plunging down at 300 miles an hour, aimed at the heart of the most powerful fleet in the Pacific. The first bombs fell toward Akagi and Kaga, more toward Soryu, and in the next set of them everything that Nagumo had built, careful decision, every disciplined choice, veteran crew and irreplaceable specialist, the whole magnificent, invincible Kido Butai would vanish into fire. One bomb found Akagi. It punched through her flight deck and burst in the upper hangar, in among the fueled and armed aircraft. Two more bombs fell close alongside, near misses, but one of them struck the water near her stern, with force enough to jam her rudder and buckle her plating. It was a single direct hit. It was enough. Fires bloomed and spread, and the secondary explosions began. Fuel, then aircraft, then the ordnance being handled below, one feeding the next until the fire walked through the ship like the end of the world. Fuchida, who had come up on deck to watch the launch, felt the ship heave beneath him and heard a deep shuddering roar. He looked and could not believe what he saw. The flight deck erupted. Flames shot into the sky. Aircraft loaded with fuel and weapons became bombs themselves, blowing apart one after another. Damaged control parties rushing toward the fires were simply gone, incinerated where they stood. Black smoke poured over the bridge. Nagumo stood frozen. Around him, his officers shouted over one another. The fire mains were ruptured. The communications were failing. Within minutes, Akagi, the flagship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, the proud heart of the Kido Butai, was dead in the water, burning out of control. Kaga died even faster. 4 bombs struck her in quick succession. One burst forward near her bridge and killed nearly everyone in the command center in a single instant. Others tore down into her hangar spaces, setting fire to the fueled aircraft and aviation gasoline below, for her strike planes, too, were not massed on deck awaiting launch, but caught in the enclosed spaces where fire spread fastest. Burning aviation fuel poured through the ship like a river of liquid fire, and men who could no longer bear the heat leaped from her sides into the sea. Survivors would later swear the flames were so fierce that paint blistered and peeled off the escorting destroyers hundreds of yards away. And Soryu, the smallest of the 4, took 3 bombs in barely 2 minutes. Every one of them tore through her flight deck and burst in the hangar among the aircraft below. She became a furnace end to end. Her captain, Ryosaku Yamamoto, refused to leave. He stood on his burning bridge and would not be moved, choosing to go down with his ship, while a destroyer came alongside and could pull men only from the water, never from the inferno of the deck itself. 3 carriers, each of them more than 600 feet of steel and power and pride, each of them the terror of the Pacific for 6 months. All 3 burning wrecks in less than 6 minutes. Right up until the last, the men of the Kido Butai had believed they were winning. They had watched the enemy throw wave after wave of aircraft to their deaths, and every time they had felt more certain, more untouchable. They never saw it coming because the danger had never been the aircraft they were shooting down. It had been the certainty itself, and 10 miles to the north, one carrier had not yet been touched. From the bridge of Hiryu, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched 3 pillars of black smoke rise from the sea where his comrades had been, and reached for the only answer a man like him knew how to give. Taman Yamaguchi did not hesitate. 3 of his 4 carriers were burning. 3/4 of the striking power of the Japanese Navy was gone in the space of 6 minutes. Any reasonable man would have thought about survival, about pulling back, about saving what was left. Yamaguchi thought about hitting back. Hiryu had been separated from the main formation, steaming 10 miles to the north, and that distance had saved her. The American dive bombers had spent themselves on her 3 sisters. Hiryu was untouched, and Yamaguchi, the most aggressive admiral in the fleet, still had aircraft, still had crews, and still had a fight left in him. He launched everything he could. 18 dive bombers, 6 fighters, thrown into Saskatchewan in the hour, sent racing back along the path the American planes had come from to find the enemy carriers and make them pay. They found Yorktown, the ghost raised from the dead in 3 days at Pearl Harbor. Yamaguchi's dive bombers came screaming down on her, and though her fighters and her guns tore most of them out of the sky, 3 of them got through. 3 bombs struck Yorktown's deck, one after another. Fires erupted. The blast killed and wounded scores of her men. Her engines faltered and slowed and then stopped. She sat dead in the water, pouring smoke into the sky. For one brief, fragile moment, it looked like a trade. 3 Japanese carriers for 1 American. A disaster, yes, but not a total one, not yet. And Yamaguchi was not finished. In the early afternoon, he launched again, his second strike, 10 torpedo planes and 6 fighters, everything Hiryu had left. They found Yorktown a second time, but by now her crew had worked a small miracle. They had fought the fires, patched the boilers, gotten her moving again, and to the incoming Japanese pilots, this ship underway, undamaged looking, had to be a different carrier. They thought they had found a second one. They bored in through the anti-aircraft fire. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown in the port side. She heeled over, listing hard, her power gone again. This time the order came to abandon ship and her men began going over the side into the sea. Yamaguchi had done the impossible. With a single carrier, against 3, he had crippled an American flat top twice over. To the men of Hiryu, it must have felt for an instant like defiance itself had turned the tide. But Hiryu could not hide for long. Her counterstrikes had pointed the Americans toward the last surviving Japanese carrier, but it was a scout plane from Yorktown that finally found her and fixed her position. That report sent the last strike into the air. Enterprise's dive bombers, joined by 14 from Yorktown, flying off Enterprise's deck. Late in the afternoon, some 24 dive bombers fell on Hiryu, alone on the sea. They came down out of the sky in the same way the others had hours before. The same scream of engines, the same plunge from the high blue. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in quick succession, and the same nightmare that had consumed her, 3 sisters, now consumed her. Fueled aircraft exploded. Fire tore through her hangar. By nightfall, she was a blazing hulk, dead in the water, drifting in the dark. In less than 8 hours, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai, the strike force that had ruled the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, were sunk or sinking. On Hiryu's burning deck, Taman Yamaguchi made his choice. He would not leave. Along with the ship's captain, Tomeo Kaku, he refused evacuation and chose to stay with his carrier and his men. In the first hours of the morning, a Japanese destroyer put torpedoes into Hiryu's hull to end her agony, and she went down, carrying her admiral with her. Yamaguchi was 49 years old. Many had believed he would one day command the entire Navy. Now he was gone, lost with the ship he refused to abandon, a fighter to the last, brave and unbreakable and utterly, tragically unable to change a battle that had already been decided by men in a basement 2,000 miles away. 300 miles to the west, aboard the great battleship Yamato, the man who had designed it all was learning the truth in fragments. Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the operations room, surrounded by his staff, waiting on messages that came in broken and incomplete. Akagi reported fires, then went silent. Kaga sent one last message and stopped. Soryu said nothing at all. Only Hiryu had kept transmitting long enough to report her counterattacks before she too fell silent. By evening, there was no hiding from it. All 4 carriers were lost or dying. Yamamoto's staff urged him to salvage something. He still had battleships and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. If he could force the Americans into a night battle where their aircraft could not fly and Japanese guns and torpedoes ruled the dark, perhaps the victory could still be seized. He gave the order. Every ship in range would race east through the night and converge on the enemy, but the arithmetic was merciless. His battleships could make 27 knots. The American carriers, if they simply turned and withdrew, could open the distance faster than he could close it. And why would they stay? They had already won. There was no reason on earth for the American commander to risk his ships in a night brawl when he could pull back and strike again at dawn with the sun and the aircraft on his side. The Americans did exactly that. They withdrew to the east. By midnight, it was clear the convergence would never catch them, and that if Yamamoto's battleships were still east when the sun came up, they would face the same dive bombers that had gutted his carriers, with no air cover of their own. And there was a question no one aboard could yet answer. How had the Americans been waiting in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time? That night, Yamamoto and his staff did not know. They reached for the familiar explanations. A failure of reconnaissance, a lapse, bad luck, broken communications, the ordinary friction of war. The truth was worse than any of these, and it would take much longer to face, that American codebreakers had reconstructed the whole operation in advance, from fragments of a naval code they had partly broken and patiently pieced together. But that understanding did not arrive in the operations room then that evening. It crept in later, slowly like cold water rising. Midway had not been an ambush that went wrong. It had been a counter-ambush, executed by an enemy who had read the script before the curtain ever rose. Just before dawn on the 5th of June, Yamamoto canceled the Midway operation and ordered the fleet to withdraw. Japan had turned back before. The invasion of Port Moresby had been called off only a month earlier, after the Coral Sea. But this was something different. This was the combined fleet's first great decisive defeat at sea, and every officer in that room understood the difference. The withdrawal itself brought one more tragedy, self-inflicted. In the darkness, a division of heavy cruisers turned hard to void an American submarine, the Tambor that had been spotted nearby. In the confusion of the maneuver, Mogami rammed her sister Makuma, crushing Mogami's own bow and tearing open Makuma's port side. Fuel spilled from the wound and spread across the sea in a long, telltale slick. Over the next 2 days, dive bombers hunted the crippled cruisers down. Makuma was struck again and again until she capsized and sank, taking hundreds of men with her. Mogami, battered nearly to death, somehow survived to limp home, a year in the yards ahead of her. 2 more warships wrecked, not in any grand battle, but by confusion and darkness and the unstoppable momentum of defeat. When the accounting was finally done, the scale of it was staggering. 4 fleet carriers gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, half of Japan's frontline carrier strength. The heavy cruiser Mikuma sunk, Mogami wrecked. Some 248 aircraft lost and roughly 3,057 men, most of them, about 2,100, dying aboard the 4 carriers themselves. But here the popular memory of Midway gets one thing wrong. Only around 110 of Japan's carrier aircrew were killed. The battle did not, in a single day, wipe out the veteran pilots. What it destroyed was harder to see, and just as hard to replace. The 4 carriers themselves, the skilled mechanics and ordnance men and deck crews who made a carrier fight. Trained practice cohesion of the 1st Air Fleet, the finest carrier force in the world, gutted in an afternoon. America lost the carrier Yorktown, finished off by a submarine 2 days later, while under tow, along with the destroyer, more than 100 aircraft and over 300 men. On paper, a lopsided exchange in America's favor. But the true asymmetry ran deeper than any hull. American shipyards were already laying down a new generation of carriers, an armada rising from the industrial heartland. Japan would build more carriers too. Taiho, the Unryu class, conversions from other hulls, but it could never match the scale or the speed of American production, and it could never rebuild the integrated carrier force it had lost at Midway. Not quickly, and in the end, not at all. The truth was buried at home. Imperial General Headquarters announced a great victory. The Japanese public was told of American carriers sunk and never told of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, or Hiryu, but the men who had been there knew. In the wardrooms and the crew quarters of the retreating fleet, they carried the same silent, forbidden understanding. The war had turned. The men themselves carried it to the end. Nagumo was not finished with carriers after Midway. He would command a carrier force again months later, in the Great Guadalcanal at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz before finally being moved to shore commands. 2 years after Midway, during the American assault on Saipan, he took his own life rather than face capture. And Yamamoto, the architect of it all, would be killed less than a year after Midway when American codebreakers intercepted his flight plan and sent fighters to shoot his aircraft down over the jungles of Bougainville. The same weapon that had set the trap at Midway reached out and killed the man who planned Pearl Harbor. Midway did not end the war, and it did not end Japan's ability to attack. In the months that followed, the Japanese Navy still mounted major offensives around Guadalcanal, still fought savage carrier battles at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, still bled the Americans at every turn. What Midway did was stop Operation MI Cold and restore a rough balance between the fleets. The initiative in the Pacific did not change hands in 6 minutes off Midway. It shifted slowly, painfully, across the long campaigns of 1942 and 1943, above all in the grinding fight for Guadalcanal. But Midway is where the shift began. What Midway ended was something else, the belief that Japan could win the war on its own terms, in one decisive stroke, before America's factories fully woke. The trap the Japanese admirals realized they had sailed into was never set by American dive bombers. It was set months before by their own unshakable certainty, the certainty that such a trap could not possibly exist.